60Hz, 144Hz, not bad. 240Hz, now you're talking. 360Hz, you're a bit of an eSports fanatic. And 500Hz is absolutely mind-blowing. Or is it? Today we're looking at the AOC Agon Pro AG276QKD2, which features a flat 26.5-inch glossy QD-OLED panel that operates a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of, you guessed it, 500Hz. It also supports adaptive sync technologies and has got DisplayHDR True Black 500 certification, one-upping some of its predecessors. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for roughly £680. And in this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag, and of course, if it's something that you should actually invest in. So to kick things off, let's talk about its input lag, and here it's seriously impressive, as you might expect from a modern monitor. Now, it's worth pointing out over here that 3D Monitor's OSD, you've got a low input lag mode, which you'll certainly want to have enabled at any given point. I'm not really sure why the option is here. Nonetheless, it is worth highlighting over here that if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, it will grey it out, but will still remain on. From my own test, I had no issues while playing more casual games with adaptive sync technologies enabled, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Furthermore, when I was playing hardcore competitive games and disabling adaptive sync technologies altogether in order not to have a capped frame rate, I was able to notice that the monitor's input lag was actually really low, and therefore my mouse clicks were responding instantaneously on the screen. So no issues whatsoever to report in this department. Now, similarly, when it comes to its response times, it's absolutely incredible and jaw-dropping. No surprise yet again, given it's an OLED monitor, but it's something really to behold. Using the OSRTT tool, you'll be able to see over here that on your screen, the average initial time, which translates to the average G to G, sits at just 0.9 milliseconds. And indeed over here, it's almost got a perfect percented window at 500Hz. In other words, it's properly outputting 500Hz and therefore giving you a really low response time. Again, something that you might come to expect with a OLED monitor, but it's yet again good to see it in action. Now, in terms of the overall motion clarity, yet again over here, it does do a stupendously good job. 500Hz is a notable increase in terms of motion clarity over 360Hz and below. The only caveat over here is, unlike some other competitor products out there, which have also got a 500Hz QD-OLED panel, this AOC monitor does not have any sort of BFI, in other words motion blur reduction technology, which I do think is a real missed trick and quite unfortunate. This means that you cannot get an even clearer image at the lower refresh rate ranges, for example 240Hz, to replicate what you'd get at 500Hz. Therefore, for you to get the utmost experience with this monitor and to get the benefits of it, you'll be wanting to not only have it set at 500Hz, but also outputting 500 FPS consistently. And this brings me on to one of the key talking points of this review. Can you consistently output 500 FPS at 1440p on any game that you play? I highly doubt it. But I'm sure there's certain individuals out there that have got the most beefiest CPU and GPU combination known to man, and also regularly drop their graphic settings and resolution in-game in order to maximize on FPS. And for those individuals, what I showcased before in terms of the UFO ghosting test, that is going to be very much applicable to you. You're going to get that extra bit of motion clarity and that extra bit of fluidity. As someone like myself who's reviewed over 300 monitors, shoved over 3,000 hours on competitive Counter-Strike, and just came from a 360Hz QD-OLED monitor by Philips, I was able to notice the difference when going to this 500Hz monitor. However, for the vast majority of consumers, that won't be the case. It is also worth considering over here that you also get diminishing returns as you go up the refresh rate range. In other words, comparing 60Hz to 144Hz is night and day. 144Hz to 240Hz, again, is not as much, but you can certainly see the difference. Then going 240 to 360Hz is a lot harder. Then 360Hz to 500Hz, then the jump is again much more minimal. Just worth considering before you go out and splash out on any sort of 500Hz 1440p monitor, because I really want to be transparent and also honest with you guys so that you do make the best sort of informed purchasing decision. So put all of that to one side and let's talk about adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync. Now the monitor has got a VRR range from 48 up to 500 Hz. And in my case I've got an RTX 3080, and when I hooked up the monitor over DisplayPort or HDMI, I was able to run the Nvidia Pendulum demo without encountering any sort of black screen issues. However, very much like all the other OLEDs that I've tested to date, there is a little bit of flickering. VR flicker is something that is known to every single OLED unless there's sort of technologies that are done to counteract that. And unfortunately over here, if you've got sensitive eyes, it's just something that you might want to consider. In other words, disabling adaptive sync technologies in order for you to get no flickering whatsoever. Now it is a little bit over exaggerated when you look at it on YouTube because of cameras and how they run, but in person, for me, it wasn't actually going to be something that really bothered me, especially when it came to playing a game such as Destiny 2. Now this does actually bring me onto HDR, which was absolutely phenomenal. See here I was able to run HDR simultaneously at 1440p at 500 Hz with Nvidia G-Sync enabled. And yet again I had no problems with all the technologies running in tandem. Thanks to the fact that this monitor has got True Black 500 certification, which is up from the True Black 400 certification of other OLED monitors, it meant that this monitor actually got even brighter in HDR. As a result, the overall HDR image looked really lifelike and had a really good contrast as well, thanks to the fact that it has got an OLED panel. Therefore, meant that when it came to playing a game such as Destiny 2, I was left jaw-dropped at the overall image quality, let alone the overall motion clarity and the fluidity that I was able to benefit from, and the extra sort of headroom that I had thanks to the fact that it was a 500 Hz monitor. Past gaming performance, let's talk about image quality. And as a reminder, you have got a flat, glossy 26.5-inch QD-OLED gaming monitor that runs a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that goes up to 500 Hz. The overall text clarity is fantastic, although I'll be touching upon this very shortly, and in terms of the overall glare, well, it's certainly present. Due to that glossy panel, or semi-glossy to be more specific, it means that you have got reflections that can be noticed if you have got a bright sunlit room. In terms of the overall color accuracy, you've got a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD, and it's also good to see that you've got full brightness controls. Now in said mode and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 97.9% and a gamut volume of 100.3%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta sits at just 0.9 with a maximum of 2.14. Therefore it can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. The tested contrast ratio came in at infinity to 1, with the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target coming in close at 6242 Kelvin at 100%. Equally, it's good to see that the monitor is tracking very close to the Gamma 2.2 standards. Now, if you're not going to be editing in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. For example, you can go onto DCI-P3 mode, or preferably on the panel native mode with the warm presets. The combination over here gives you even more control and will certainly be appreciated as it gives you a little bit of extra pop from your image. Handy, for example, if you're going to be using this monitor for watching movies, browsing the web, or of course gaming. Now past color performance, let's talk about brightness. And here in HDR I clocked in a peak of 994 nits. And this was in the HDR modes that one can select via the monitor's OSD, and with ramping up the brightness up to 100%. If, however, you want a bit more of a color accurate reproduction, you'll definitely want to go on the DisplayHDR mode. However, this will cap the peak brightness at roughly 500 nits. In terms of SDR brightness, it's actually pretty good at 301 nits, therefore making it a lot brighter than older generation OLEDs. And as for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 21 nits. So therefore, this monitor can be used not only in a bright sunlit room at roughly 60 to 70% brightness, but can also be used in a completely pitch black environment at roughly 0 to 5% brightness. Speaking of which, this brings me onto brightness uniformity, and you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board, which is certainly very impressive. Furthermore, here, given the fact that it's got an OLED panel, it means it can switch off all of its pixels, and therefore backlight bleed is a non-issue no matter what sort of scenario that you throw it in. So while that's all very well and good, there are certain considerations that you should have before getting an OLED gaming monitor, specifically if you're coming from a TN, IPS or VA panel. I mention this on every single OLED gaming monitor review purely because it should be certainly emphasized for those people who are not aware that OLED monitors require a little bit of extra TLC. Now, of course, here I'm talking about the burn-in effect, which has been something that plagues OLED technology for as far as I can remember. Now here you have got a 3-year warranty from the manufacturer, which is certainly appreciated, and you've also got ways of mitigating via the monitor's OSD. Technologies such as the likes of pixel orbiting, screensaver, logo protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and thermal protection all prevent the use of burn-in. Furthermore, you've also got something called auto pixel refresh, which will effectively do a pixel refresh when the monitor is in standby, something that you'll certainly want to have enabled at any given time. If for some reason, however, you do disable it or accidentally disable it, and you have not done a pixel refresh manually, then after roughly 16 hours of cumulative usage, the monitor will force itself into a pixel refresh, and therefore means that you might get some downtime. Thankfully, this probably won't be the case for a lot of individuals, and as someone who actually owns an OLED now, it's not something that has actually bothered me, even though I spend a lot of hours in front of my computer, and yes, I know it's not exactly great for my posture or my overall health, but still something I thought I should highlight. Furthermore, it is also worth mentioning the fringing effect, which is something that plagued OLED specifically in their first or second generations. This is effectively a sort of highlight or shadow that you will get in certain text, or for example when you're looking at certain objects of different colors. This is just due to the overall subpixel layout on OLEDs, which differs from regular LCD panels. Thankfully, however, this has very much been mitigated over the years, and in this QD-OLED monitor, I had no problems whatsoever while reading text. And someone who does look at lots of text, I can safely say that this can be used for a long period of time without you even having to notice it. But still, I thought I should highlight it just in case there's certain scenarios where you find that there's a little bit of an odd highlight around a certain object or text. Moving on, we get on to its overall build quality, and here you've got a 3-side boreless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel, therefore meaning that this 26.5-inch monitor doesn't take up too much space on your desk. The stand itself is also very sturdy and ergonomic, providing you height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustments. And yes, it can even be rotated both ways. What I don't like, however, is that the stand has got an asymmetrical design, which really drives my OCD up the wall. This has actually been done for eSports gamers that shove their face directly into the monitor and have a really odd keyboard and mouse setup. Still, I just don't really think this is a good idea, and it would have been great if there was just a normal stand. Thankfully, however, you can replace the built-in stand with a VESA-compatible one because there is a bracket that can be found within the box. Here, this will allow you to place it on a multi-monitor setup or, of course, a monitor arm. Now, at the back of the monitor, there are these nonsensical RGB lights. They don't really serve a purpose and are completely redundant, at least in my opinion. Of course, if you want to showcase to your wall that you've got some RGB lights and you also want to increase your power consumption, then just knock yourself out. Here, if you are like myself and you do want to disable the RGB lights, then you can do that via the monitor's OSD. This can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's conveniently found at the back right-hand side of the monitor. The OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and easy to understand, and furthermore very responsive. As an extension to this, you've also got the AOC G menu software, which effectively allows you to adjust certain settings on the fly. Now, through the monitor's OSD, you will have noticed that there is an audio setting, and yes, you can output audio directly via the 3.5mm jack, allowing you to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor. There are also 2 5-watt speakers built in as well, although they do sound pretty tinny, but will suffice for basic music listening or of course gaming. Now, in terms of connectivity, you've got 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports and also a pretty impressive DisplayPort 2.1 input. Now, not only that these ports all will able to output 1440p at 500Hz, but you'll also be able to use VRR, in other words, adaptive sync technologies. And yes, be it on PC or console. In fact, via HDMI, you've got a dedicated console mode per se, which pretty much limits the overall refresh rate, ensuring that you have got good compatibility, even with older devices. Now, elsewhere, you've got a singular USB Type-B input, which is used for accessing the 2 USB Type-A ports. Handy, for example, if you've got a flash drive or if you want to plug in your peripherals directly into the monitor. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of this 500Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor by AOC. And yes, indeed, it does a tremendous job across the board, namely when it comes to its overall gaming performance. Should you be able to output 1440p at 500 FPS consistently, you'll get that extra bit of motion clarity and also fluidity. Furthermore, you've got fantastically low input lag and response times, great sort of HDR reproduction and also support for adaptive sync technologies, good sRGB color accuracy, and also a panel that has really got a good sort of pop in terms of its image. Then you've also got a comprehensively laid out OSD and also a really nice design, albeit with slightly odd stands. Now, given all of this, it gets my performance award. Now, the reason I can't outright recommend it is because its overall asking price is very similar to some of its main competitors, which effectively have got the same sort of panel but with some extra features, namely, for example, the use of MBR, motion blur reduction, which will effectively be very handy for those people that can't consistently output 500 FPS in certain games. And that's unfortunate for this AOC monitor because that's a feature that I would have really liked to see and also experience for myself. But unfortunately, that's not been the case. Now, nonetheless, I'll be curious to know what you make of the monitor down in the comment section below and how you feel a 500Hz monitor might or might not complement your setup. Now, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.